This video is about a teaching technique called grounding. And what it means is when you're focusing your classes or your seminars on self-protection or self-defense, when people walk into the class, they're still carrying some of their normal everyday life from the outside world with them into there. So if you imagine you walk into your class and you're still carrying the fact that I've got dinner to put on at 8, I've got kids to pick up, I've got work to do, I've got bills to pay, I've got my mum to go and see, I've got all these things buzzing around my head. And even though you can whip a class into focus with a bit of hard exercise, landing the gravity and the tonality and the importance of the subject matter at hand is a really important thing to do to help people put the outside world outside and help them really land on a focus area of self-defense and self-protection. Now, for me, one of the things I quite like to do when it comes to grounding is to get the students to understand a little bit of true crime. Read to them stories, narrate to them, orate to them, help them watch and see things that get across the tonality and the gravitas of what we're talking about. So I'm going to explain to you the exercise I do, and hopefully you can do a little bit with it with me. So what I like to do is get people sat down. We spend about 1 minute in just companionable silence. So we just shut up. Everybody shuts up, and we just take a moment to be silent. And really try and just expunge as many thoughts as possible, just focusing on the breathing. So you've got 1 minute of silence. You can close your eyes if you wish, but you're just breathing in and out, and you're getting people to slowly push the outside world out of their mind. And then I like to get them to close their eyes and listen to a story, and that story would normally thematically link to some of the things that you're working on in the class. It doesn't always have to be a very tangible link. Sometimes it helps, but most of the time there is some tangential relationship between the story, the nature of the story, and the physical and the verbal things that we may be doing a bit later. And so I'm going to read to you some of the stories that I like and some of the sources from which I get those stories. So we're going to start off. This is one of my favorite self-defense books, not really because of the techniques, and the techniques are good, is that the first 2/3 of this book, No Second Chance, a reality-based guide to self-defense by Mark Hatmaker, is about stories, themed stories, to help you understand a bit of context. So I'm going to read some of them to you. So you imagine in the context of the class, people have come in, I've got them to shut up, be quiet, breathe, push the thoughts out of their mind. So I want to make a bit of room. And in that room, I'm going to put a little bit of context. So I'd read a story like so. Lawrence Sigmund Bittiker and Roy Lewis Norris were two men with a plan. They decided to kidnap, rape, and murder one girl for each of the teenage years, 13 through to 19, and record this brutality on film and tape. To assist in controlling the environment as much as possible, Bittiker obtained a van in November of 1978 that he dubbed the Murder Mac. The duo would drive the van alongside the chosen victim, spray her in the face with mace, and then pull her through the bay door. The radio would be blaring to drown out the screams, and the victim would be duct taped into submission as the van drove to a secluded mountain road where the activities could be taped and filmed without interruption. On June 24th, 1978, following a church function, 16-year-old Linda Schaefer disappeared, never to be seen again. On July 8, 1978, 18-year-old Joy Hall of Redondo Beach, California, disappeared, never to be seen again. On September 2nd, 1978, Jacqueline Lamp, 13, and Jackie Gillingham, 15, disappeared, never to be seen again. On October 31st, 1978, 16-year-old Shirley Ledford was abducted. Her body, the only one to be recovered, was found the next day. She'd been subjected to sadistic and barbaric abuse. She was covered with bruises. Her face and her breasts were mutilated and her arms slashed. She was finally strangled to death with a coat hanger. Bittiker and Norris are linked to at least 30 other murders. Now, that's pretty chilling stuff. I understand that this story is at the very, very extreme end of the very complex spectrum of violence, but it helps put into context. If you're teaching a class which covers things like secondary locations, the fact that all of these victims were taken in a van to secondary locations is a really important thing to land. If you think about things like awareness, these men are in a strange van. They're pulling up to you in a strange van. And then the people are being sprayed in the face with chemical irritants, with mace, before being pulled in. And the fact these people have the wherewithal to have the radio up as well to drown out the screams, all of these things start to address typical lazy fallbacks that students have of, I just scream or shout or call for help, or my well-meaning father-in-law's bought me a rape alarm. All these things, you start to see how much of a nonsense they are. They're all layers of security and things you could do, but it helps people understand the gravity and tonality and that kind of chilling story. Once you've brought people in and sat them down and got them to be quiet, when you start to look at the more technique-orientated stuff or the situational awareness-orientated stuff, it starts to land a little bit more fully. It starts to ingrain that little bit better because people have seen it in context and felt a bit of context and they've understood. So another story for you. Alvin and Judith Ann Neely were husband and wife as well as gut-wrenching predators. The duo have 15 victims attributed to them, and this is a brief description of only their first foray into repugnance. In Rome, Georgia, on September 25th, 1982, 13-year-old Lisa Milliken was abducted from a shopping mall. She was held prisoner for several days in a series of low-rent motel rooms, where she was repeatedly raped and molested in front of the Neely's children. When it was decided that Lisa had outlived her usefulness, Judith Ann attempted to murder her by injecting the girl with drain cleaner. Judith Ann repeatedly missed the vein and injected the toxic substance into the muscle, reducing the girl's flesh to the consistency the coroner would later call the consistency of anchovy paste. Lisa endured several more inept injections until the affair finally killed her with gunshots. Her body was dumped in Little River Canyon in Alabama. Now again, we get a feel for, just because people are husband and wife or look like they're wholesome families, if they've got children, they can still be terrible, terrible people. And so it helps people understand that the illusion of what would be a lovely, friendly nuclear family, and they couldn't possibly be a risk from those types of people. Stories like that start to make you realize that, well, no, the threats could come from anywhere, in any direction. Again, it reaffirms the notion of secondary locations and how dangerous they are. And it helps you understand that once you are in those locations, you are proper fucked. So again, with these stories, they land and they're hard to listen to and they make you feel sad and they make you feel a bit sick and it's not fun anymore and you're not just bashing pads and you're not just screaming, get back, and you're not just cycling hammer fists, that it lands the gravity of the situation with the students and helps them realize that these are the things that you are training for. These are the things you are physically training for. And these are the things that you are psychologically training for so that you are aware enough to not fall victim to these things, that you have the right frame of mind to be in safe places, take safe routes, layer your security, be aware and in tune with your environment at all times. Stories like this really do land you there. And another one here. Coral Eugene Watts had a pathological hatred of women. On October 25th, 1979, he randomly knocked on apartment doors and choked 2 women unconscious. He made no attempt at rape or robbery, and when he read that his victims had survived, he obtained a knife. On October 30th, he stabbed 19-year-old co-ed Gloria Steele 33 times. After serving time for these crimes, he returned to murder. On October 31st, he invaded the home of 35-year-old Jean Klin and slashed her to death. In 1980, 18-year-old Shirley Small was hacked to death in her apartment. In July and September of that same year, Glenda Richmond and Rebecca Huff suffered similar fates. In October, 20-year-old Sandra Dalp was the next victim, but fortunately she survived. On March 27th, 1981, Edith Leader, a 34-year-old medical student, was stabbed to death while jogging. And on September 12th, 25-year-old Elizabeth Montgomery was attacked while walking her dog. 2 hours later, 21-year-old Susan Wolfe was knifed to death outside of her apartment. In January 1982, 27-year-old Phyllis Tam was found outside of the campus of Rice University, hanged with an article of her clothing. That same month, another Rice student, Margaret Fossey, was found dead in the trunk of her car, her larynx crushed, and the list of murders goes on and on. February 7th, Elena Samanda. March 19th, Emily Lacroix. March 31st, Mary Castillo. April 3rd, Christine MacDonald. April 5th, Suzanne Searles. April 15th, Corrie Mae Jefferson. April 16th, Yolanda de Gracia. May 1st, Steri Strauss. And 2 weeks later, Gloria Clavelis. On May 23rd, 1982, Watts was caught fleeing from a Houston apartment where he had assaulted Laurie Lister, who was half drowned in her bathtub, and Melinda Orgler, who escaped by throwing herself from a balcony. Upon his arrest, another victim, Michelle Madej, was found strangled to death in her bathtub. Watts committed these crimes over the course of years and eluded the police of several states. He had tested an IQ of 75. Now, what can you learn from this? What can students learn from this if you use this to add some grounding to set the tone? Well, in this one, it explains that some violence absolutely can be completely at random. So even if you've got a very safe circle and there are very safe people around you and you feel confident in the people around you, random violence can and does happen, albeit it is rarer than familial violence. It shows you how people get better at this stuff. People that start off with strangulation might move into weapons, into different types of kidnap and different types of assault. So even very stupid people like this man, IQ of 75, people learn and people get better and people get more adept at this type of stuff. You can see that the people that have successfully escaped have done so using all means. So we saw that Melinda Orgler escaped by throwing herself from a balcony. So understand that people can and should do everything it takes to escape, every possible thing. Can you imagine the guts it takes to throw yourself from a balcony? We have no idea how high, but understand the fear it must take to chuck yourself over something, as opposed to trying to plead or converse or convince, because that ship has well and truly sailed. So that having the presence of mind to do that and be brave enough to do that really does matter. So understand that these things can happen over time. Again, secondary locations are really important. Again, weapons are a very large factor. These things can be very random, and that you might have to go to great pains and great danger to escape in these scenarios. So again, really quite horrible stuff, really horrible stuff, but it grounds the reality or grounds the feelings that students have when they're training. They're no longer just punching pads, or they're no longer faking their way or bluffing their way through a little bit of fence work or a little bit of in-dojo de-escalation. It really starts to build in people's minds what they need to do. And another great source for these stories is Tim Larkin's When Violence is the Answer. So this is a great story here. In 2006, a young British lawyer named Thomas Price exited the tube station by his home. It was early January, about 11:30 at night, and it was cold. Tom had just left a work function in London, and he was hustling back to the flat he shared with his fiancée in a quiet street in an up-and-coming suburb of London. On this night, he was followed by 2 young men in hooded sweatshirts who had robbed someone else earlier in the day and saw Tom as another opportunity. They circled in front of him and drew their knives, demanding his valuables. He quickly complied, handing over everything, and if the incident had ended there, we might say that Tom had used his social skills to escape an instance of social aggression. He saw 2 assailants who, however intimidating and dangerous, were still offering a recognisable, if coercive, exchange, his possessions for his life, straight up, and he accepted the exchange. He kept quiet, offered no resistance, and gave up his property exactly how the authorities tell you to do in a robbery situation like that. Thomas was shaken up, but he kept walking home, and the young men came back. This time their knives were already drawn, their heads were down, and they weren't saying anything. Thomas broke into a sprint, but they quickly overtook him and began stabbing him repeatedly in the chest, hip, face, hands, and torso. He yelled frantically, "Why? Why? Why? You've got everything." But they didn't have everything. They didn't have the one thing they needed once they realised he had seen their faces. They didn't have his silence. He could identify us, they said to themselves, according to the Metropolitan Police, who interrogated the men upon their capture. We needed to kill him. That quick realization was all it took for those young men to go from opportunistic robbers to cold-blooded murderers, social aggression to asocial violence in the blink of an eye. And again, stories like this, you can discern a lot. You can discern a huge amount of things. You can discern how instances can morph and change, and they can go from seemingly innocuous to life-threatening, to very, very dangerous, to awful and catastrophic. You can see how trends start to emerge. If this man's being mugged, he's being mugged by multiple people at night. He's being mugged with weapons. And these people come back and they kill him. They kill him because he's been identified them. He's identified them. He's seen their faces. What can you also learn? Well, the fact that when they came back a second time, they weren't communicating. Their heads were down. They weren't talking. This lets you know all you need to know about how this scenario has changed. It's gone from a commercial transaction to where I'm communicating using my voice and the threat of violence to get an exchange to I'm now just coming in to do you in and stab you up. And you'll notice that physiologically it's completely different. They've come down, faces down, not making eye contact, stab, 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 chase people down, stab, stab, stab. It's a very, very, very different story. It's a very scary story. So again, things like that help land the context that if you're doing, say, the typical mugging scenario, how the typical mugging scenario can evolve into something much more potent and much worse. And these things enrich your knowledge and enrich your experience and allow you to, when you do this in a grounding technique, to set the tone of a class, to land the right things psychologically in your student's mind, but also allow you to be a bit more true to life when you expand out scenarios. All martial arts instructors tend to be a bit limp when it comes to scenario-based training. Using real stories, you don't get realer than real. So if you can start to emulate and use things from the real world, albeit, it'd be very rare for the same instances to happen time and time again. If you pick things that have pretty typical patterns to them, you can start to draw out a lot from those scenarios. So my advice is to invest in material where you can get some of these true to life stories. So Mark Hatmaker's book, Tim Larkin's book. There's a great Instagram channel called Crime Lab, which is fantastic. You could look at local crime near to you. You could look at things that are recent to the area too. So you could look at local news and crime waves that are happening near you and use those stories. You can fictionalize elements because whilst these are true stories, what really matters is the mindset shift and the tonal shift in students from when they come in laughing, joking, catching up with their best mates that they spar with all the time to we're doing something with purpose and gravity here. This type of technique. So come into the dojo, shut up for a minute, push things out your mind, close your eyes, engage with a story or series of stories, and then link that to the techniques and the strategies that you're practicing today has a really, really good effect on content retention. How much do I remember about this class? About mindset shift and about being true to the real world. So I think if you want to try something out with your students, if you want to land any lesson with a bit more gravity and a bit more grit, then I would really advise this grounding technique using real stories. Own and set the tone as the instructor and see how that changes the nature of your classes. Sometimes you can throw in good news stories as well, where people have flipped it around, have escaped, have fought back. That's absolutely great. But I'd say if you're going to open the show, open with something a bit grittier, a bit darker, things that set people's mood so they understand what they're training for, what they're training against, and why they need to pay bloody good attention to what you're teaching. Give that a go. That's grounding.